The night my uncle introduced me to the room as the one who chose chalk over courtrooms, I was standing near the back wall of the Fairview Club holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't asked for, wearing a dress my mother had shipped to my apartment with a post-it note that said more appropriate for the occasion. I'd left it in the box. I wore my own. My family has been practicing law in the state since 1978. My grandfather built Whitmore & Associates from a single-room office above a dry cleaner in Columbus into a firm with 42 attorneys, a downtown address, and a name that gets you a better table at certain restaurants without a reservation. The waiting room has framed photographs. Grandfather at his bar exam results. My father at the firm's 25th anniversary gala. My older sister Nadine at her law school graduation, flanked by both parents, everyone beaming. I am not in any of those photographs. Not because I didn't accomplish things. Because at 22, when I told my family I wanted to teach third grade instead of take the LSAT, my father set down his coffee cup very carefully, and my mother said, to no one in particular, that she supposed some people were suited for different things. The phrase different things became the family's preferred way of explaining me away. My father's version was gentler in public. He'd say I was passionate about education, with a pause before passionate, that carried the specific weight of someone trying very hard to be charitable. I teach at Linden Grove Elementary, a public school on the east side of the city. I make $48,000 a year. I have 22 third graders who are learning to read chapter books, carry their feelings without throwing them at each other, and understand why numbers behave the way they do. Last spring, a boy named, I'll just call him my student, came in every morning for 3 weeks, furious at the world, and left every afternoon slightly less so. By April, he was reading 2 grade levels above where he'd started. His mother cried at the spring conference. I didn't tell my family about it. They wouldn't have known what to do with that. The moment I stopped expecting anything from them came 14 months ago. My school was awarded the district's Excellence in Curriculum Innovation Grant, a competitive fund given once a year to a single school. I had written the application. I had designed the literacy framework they cited in the award letter. I sent the ceremony date to the family group chat 3 weeks early. My father responded that evening. Sweetheart, I have a deposition prep that runs late. You know how these things stack up. The day after the ceremony, he was photographed at my sister Nadine's swearing in for a state bar committee. My mother was beside him. Nadine was in the center, hand raised. Everyone's faces lit up the way faces get when they mean it. I kept my grant letter in my tote bag for 2 weeks before I threw it out, not because I was ashamed of it, because I got tired of seeing it every time I reached for my keys. So when people ask why I never told my family much about Owen, why I kept that part of my life in a separate room from all of this, the simplest answer is that they never asked. They knew I was seeing someone. My mother's complete inquiry, delivered over the phone in February, lasted 4 exchanges. Is he in your field? No. Does he have a steady situation? He restores furniture. He has a workshop. A pause. Well, I suppose that's creative enough for now. And that was it. 11 months of my life summarized in one shrug. Owen Schaefer restores antique furniture from a 2,400 square foot workshop in a converted warehouse on the south end of town. He works with estate pieces, things people inherit and don't know what to do with, roll-top desks from the 1890s, Georgian dining sets, mission oak chairs with joints that have loosened over 100 years of use. He knows wood the way certain people know weather. He can tell you what a piece has been through by the way the grain has moved. He drives a white cargo van with a dent in the rear panel and keeps a measuring tape looped on his belt even when we go to dinner, which I found annoying for about 2 weeks and then found completely endearing. I met him at an estate sale in the suburbs. I was there for a lamp. He was there for a secretary desk he'd tracked through 3 auction listings. We ended up at the same folding table eating the seller's homemade cookies while we waited for the doors to open, and he asked me what the strangest thing was I'd ever found at a sale like this. I told him about the box of 1940s report cards I'd found the previous spring, 40 years of a single family's children, all their grades and teacher notes, the whole arc of a household's academic life preserved in a shoebox. He listened like that was the most interesting thing he'd heard in weeks. He asked follow-up questions. He didn't glance at his phone. He was not, however, exactly what he appeared. There were small things I noticed and filed away without making too much of. A call he stepped outside to take one Sunday morning, speaking in the low measured tone of someone who runs a meeting, not someone catching up with a friend. A manila folder on his kitchen table stamped provenance verification. Pending auction review with an institution's name I recognized from a museum catalog I'd once flipped through in a waiting room. A legal document on his workbench one evening, dense with terms like acquisition rights and fair market appraisal, his handwriting in the margins. I asked about it once. He said it was paperwork for a consignment deal. Old stuff. I let it go because it didn't change anything that actually mattered. He was one of the few people in my life who asked about my work without looking for the exit the moment I started answering. My sister Nadine's firm anniversary party was held at the Fairview Club, a private social club with dark paneling and a dining room that smells like old money and cedar. My parents had arranged it months in advance. Waitstaff in uniform, a string trio in the corner, a dessert table that had clearly been planned by someone who'd put real thought into the architecture of a buffet. Nadine was celebrating 10 years as an attorney and her 3rd year as a named partner in a boutique firm she'd co-founded. The guest of honor beyond our family was a federal judge named Harrington, a family friend and my grandfather's former law school colleague, who had driven in from Cincinnati for the occasion. Owen and I arrived on time. He wore a dark suit he'd clearly owned for a while, no tie, a white shirt with the top button open. I wore a plain green dress I'd bought myself. My mother's eyes moved over it once when we arrived and settled somewhere around my collarbone with an expression I had spent 31 years learning to read. My father greeted Owen with a handshake that communicated, in the way certain handshakes do, that he was being accommodated rather than welcomed. I had found out about the seating 3 days before the party. I hadn't been snooping. I'd come by to drop off a birthday card for my mother and overheard her on the phone in the kitchen. Voice efficient and clear. The teacher and her friend can go at the round table by the windows, near Cousin Patricia's group. They won't be part of the formal reception line. Keep the main tables for the firm people. I stood in the hallway for a moment with the card still in my hand. Not because I was surprised. I'd heard smaller versions of this my whole life. It was the phrasing. The teacher and her friend, delivered in the same tone she used to arrange the catering order. I set the card on the entryway table and left without knocking. I told Owen about it that night. He was quiet while I talked, which is one of the things about him. He doesn't fill silence to manage your discomfort. When I finished, he said, "Do you want to skip it?" I thought about it seriously. "No," I said. "I need to go one more time and see it clearly. And then I'm done." He nodded. "Then I'll be there." The round table by the windows was fine technically. It had a real centerpiece, a low arrangement of white flowers that had clearly been ordered in bulk and distributed without much thought to which tables received them. Our name cards were printed on plain white stock. The main tables had engraved cards with the firm's letterhead embossed at the top. Judge Harrington sat at the center table beside my father, relaxed and warm. Silver-haired, the kind of person who fills a room without seeming to try. He glanced at our table twice in the first 15 minutes, politely the way guests scan a room. The 3rd time he stopped scanning. His eyes landed on Owen and something shifted in his face, a recognition working its way forward through time, trying to place something. My father's toast came after the first course. He stood, glass raised, and delivered what I will acknowledge was a genuinely good toast. He spoke about Nadine with the specific fluency of a man who has been paying close attention for 32 years, who knows exactly what his daughter has built and why it matters. His pride in her was real. I've never doubted that. It was always the contrast that was the problem. He looked at me about 2/3 of the way through. The pause before he said my name was brief, but I'd been measuring that pause my whole adult life, so I caught it. "My younger daughter, Lily," he said, "which isn't my name but we'll say it was something like that, chose a different path. She's in education, working with young children. Very hands-on. Very, a small breath, dedicated. His eyes moved to Owen. And she's brought along her partner who works with his hands as well. Furniture, if I have it right. A beat of polite laughter from somewhere near table 3. He looked back at me with a smile that was technically warm. We're very proud of everyone finding their calling. 60 people were looking in my direction. I cut a piece of food and put it in my mouth. Owen set down his fork. The room registered it the way a room registers a shift in air pressure. He stood without pushing his chair back loudly, without any drama, and Judge Harrington rose from the center table at almost the exact same moment, as though something had been decided between them without words. The judge crossed the floor from the center of the room to our table by the windows, and every pair of eyes in that dining room followed him. He stopped at our table. "Owen," he said. Quiet voice, quiet room. Owen looked up. "Judge Harrington." "I thought that was you. I wasn't sure at first." He glanced at me, then at my parents. My father had gone still. "Warren?" "That's not my father's name, but something close. Do you know this man?" My father managed a version of a smile. "We've just been getting acquainted." The judge looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has spent decades on the bench deciding how much truth a room can hold. "Owen Schaefer," he said, turning to address the table more broadly, "is one of the most significant private conservators of American craft furniture in this region. He's authenticated pieces for 4 major museum collections and turned down a full curatorial position at an institution I'm not going to name because he said he preferred working with his hands to working with committees." A slight smile. "His workshop handles estate-level restorations that institutions fly specialists in for. The appraisal work he did last year helped close a $14 million estate dispute because his documentation of provenance was the only thing both sides would accept as authoritative." He paused. "He's also been quietly funding a classroom restoration initiative for 3 underfunded schools on the east side of this city for the past 2 years. New materials, proper bookshelves, reading corner setups." He looked at me with something that approached warmth. "I have a feeling some of that may have landed near people you know." My father's mouth opened. Nothing came out that was shaped like a word. Owen addressed the room without raising his voice. "I didn't come tonight to make a point. I came because she asked me to, and because she is the most deliberately kind person I know. She teaches 22 kids every year how to read and how to treat each other, and how to believe they're capable of hard things, and she does it for wages that would embarrass this room if anyone said them aloud. She's never asked for recognition from this family. She's spent years accepting the space they left for her and calling it enough." He looked at my father directly. "You had almost a year to ask me a single question, beyond what I did for work. You never did. That's information too." He sat down. I sat there for about 4 seconds. My legs felt strange. My voice did not. I looked at my parents. My mother's hands folded in front of her. My father standing at his table with his toast glass still in one hand. And I said the thing I had been constructing in the back of my mind for years, without ever quite letting myself finish it. "I'm known since I was 22 that you didn't think my choices were good enough. You've never said it directly, so I spent a long time telling myself I was reading it wrong. But you just introduced me to 60 people as someone who's dedicated, and you said it like dedicated was the consolation prize. I'm not angry. I'm done. Those are different things." My mother looked at the table. "I'm not asking for anything tonight. I'm not performing. I'm just not going to keep arranging myself into something smaller so you have an easier time looking at me." I looked at Owen. "We can go." We walked out. The string trio had stopped playing at some point. I don't know exactly when. Nadine called 4 days later. She'd always been the smoother one, better at managing the family's emotional weather. Her voice was flatter than usual. She said that our parents had spent the last 4 days receiving a fairly uncomfortable amount of professional and social fallback. Judge Harrington had sent a note to the Bar Association's social committee declining to co-chair a fundraiser my father had been counting on. Two attorneys who'd attended the party had mentioned to mutual colleagues that they'd found the evening unusual. My mother had received a cool email from a woman's civic organization she was active in, asking if she'd like to step back from a speaking role at an upcoming luncheon, phrased as a gentle suggestion. I should have said something sooner, Nadine said. I knew what they were doing with the seating, and I didn't push back because it was easier not to. I believed her. Nadine has never been actively cruel, just absent in the way that people who aren't the target can afford to be absent. What do you want from me? I asked. They want to apologize. I was quiet for a moment. Do they want to apologize, or do they want the situation to resolve? She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. My mother called 2 days after that. Can you come to the house? And then, before I could deflect, I know why you'd say no. I'm not going to pretend I don't know. A long pause. We've talked. A lot. I know that we made you feel like your life was the second version of the life we wanted. And I've been trying to figure out when that started. And I think it started before you were even old enough to push back against it. And that's... Her voice shifted in a way I hadn't heard before. Something that had actually cost her something to get to. That's not a thing I can undo. But I'd like to try to do something different. That honesty surprised me. I didn't say that. I told her what I needed. 6 weeks of family sessions with a licensed therapist. Not a mediator, a therapist. Someone who would hold the structure when we couldn't, beginning with a session in which I talked without being interrupted or redirected. My mother agreed without negotiating the terms. That surprised me too. The first session was hard in ways I hadn't prepared for, including ways that were hard for me and not just for them. The second one was harder. By the fourth, something shifted that I can't describe exactly. Something like watching a window that had been painted shut for years finally admit that it could be opened, even if no one had tried yet. I don't know what my family becomes. I've been in that uncertainty long enough that I've stopped needing to resolve it on a timeline. What I know is that I drove home from the third session and sat in my car in front of my apartment for a while before going inside, and the feeling in my chest was not vindication. It was lighter than that. Like something I'd been carrying for so long I'd stopped noticing the weight had finally been set down somewhere. Not solved, just set down. Owen was reading at the kitchen table when I got home. He looked up. I sat across from him and said, "I think I'm going to be okay." He nodded like that was exactly what he'd been waiting to hear and went back to his book. There's something I keep coming back to. My family looked at Owen and saw a man with a cargo van and a workshop, and they thought they'd done the measuring. They had no idea. He was doing some of the most careful, lasting work in the region, work that required a kind of knowledge that takes decades to develop, that institutions with resources and reputations couldn't replicate, and none of it was legible on the surface because he'd never needed it to be. He just did the work. I've thought about how much energy I spent across all those years trying to make my own work legible to people who had already decided what it was worth, trying to find the right way to describe what it means to watch a child who couldn't read a full sentence in September read an entire chapter aloud in March, trying to translate it into terms they could respect. I don't do that anymore. So I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a real question, not a rhetorical one. Is there someone in your life whose value you've been measuring against a standard you inherited rather than chose? Someone you've been explaining away in shorthand for so long you've stopped noticing you're doing it? Because sometimes the most important thing isn't the credential or the salary or the title. Sometimes it's the person who asks what you love about your work, not what it pays, not what it looks like on paper, and then actually listens to the answer. I've been thinking about the word dedicated a lot since that night at the Fairview Club, the way my father said it, carefully, like he was setting something fragile down in a place where it wouldn't break anything important, and the way 60 people nodded like it was a compliment. I think he meant it as one. That's the part that used to confuse me. He wasn't lying when he said it. He just wasn't telling the whole truth either. And I spent years trying to decide if that distinction mattered. What I know now is that the choices we make about whose work we take seriously have consequences we don't always see coming. My father built a career on precision, on reading structures, on understanding what holds and what doesn't, and somehow missed what was holding right in front of him. Not because he was cruel, but because he decided early what the blueprint was supposed to look like, and anything that didn't fit that shape got filed somewhere secondary without him ever noticing he'd done it. That's not a moral failing so much as a failure of attention. But failures of attention have real costs. They land on real people. Owen never needed anyone to recognize him. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He spent years doing some of the most careful, consequential work in his field, authenticating pieces for museum collections, funding classroom renovations in schools no one was writing checks for. And he did all of it without once requiring anyone's acknowledgement to keep going. That's a kind of integrity I didn't have a word for when I first met him. I do now. It's what it looks like when someone has genuinely figured out why they do what they do, separate from anyone else's approval. The work was the point. The rest was just noise. I didn't have that yet when I walked into that party. I told myself I did, but I still flinched when my father said dedicated in that tone. I was still measuring my own worth through the gap between how I knew myself and how they described me. What changed that night? Not because of the judge's speech, but because I finally said the thing out loud, was that I stopped needing the gap to close. I stopped waiting for them to revise their assessment before I could trust my own. That's the work that doesn't show up in any award letter or grant application. The internal work of deciding what you actually believe about yourself when no one prestigious is confirming it. I've watched my students do a version of this every single year. The kid who decides in October that they're not a reader and then has to be slowly, patiently shown that that decision isn't permanent. The ones who get there aren't the ones who suddenly find it easy. They're the ones who keep showing up anyway, who build the capacity to stay with something hard until it starts to make sense. That persistence, quiet, unglamorous, not requiring any audience, is what I've spent 10 years trying to teach. It took me longer to apply it to myself. My family is still a work in progress, so am I. But I drove home from that third therapy session and sat in my car for a while. Not because I was sad, but because something had shifted that I wanted to sit inside for a minute before I went back to ordinary life. The feeling wasn't triumph. It was simpler than that. It was the feeling of having told the truth about something and not collapsed afterward. That, I think, is what integrity actually costs, and what it gives back.